If you think the volume knob on your guitar just makes it quieter or louder, then I've got some news for you. It's not quite what it does. So what is the volume knob doing then? Well, it actually behaves a lot like a gain knob would on an amp. That's to say, if you have any kind of crunch or distortion in your guitar tone, then as you roll off your volume knob from 10 down to 1, you're actually going to get less distortion and less crunch in your tone, but the volume itself is not necessarily going down. So it really is behaving more like a gain knob. And hopefully you've already learned something, but in the rest of this video, I'm going to explain why the volume knob behaves this way on a guitar. And I'm also going to show you how to make full use of it to add a ton of expressiveness to your guitar playing. So let's start with why the volume knob on a guitar basically acts like a gain knob on an amp. So to understand why this is happening, you have to kind of understand that the guitar is the first piece in the signal chain. And it's also where, sound originates from when you pluck a string or play a chord or something like that. So when you do pluck a string, the vibration of the string is picked up by your guitar's pickups, and then that's, goes through the electronics of the guitar and goes out the input jack and into whatever you're plugged into, like your amp or your interface or anything else like that. And for the sake of simplicity, we can think of a physical amp here, but really if you're using an interface with some amp sims or something like that, it's pretty much the same thing will happen. But what the volume knob is doing on the guitar is it's going to be controlling the strength of the signal that's leaving your guitar and going into the amp. And so the amp is kind of receiving this input from your guitar, and if it's lower, then it'll react accordingly. And if it's higher, it's also going to react accordingly. And so really what ends up happening is, when you send the amp a stronger signal, for example, your volume knob is at 10 or close to it, the amp just has more to work with, so it can distort more, has a really clear signal, and it's going to sound, really full-bodied and probably have a lot of clarity and that sort of thing. But when you send a weaker signal, your volume knob is lower than 10 or lower than 5 or something like that, then the amp just has less to work with. The difference between the sort of underlying hum and noise that your guitar is putting out and the actual signal you're sending it that difference is going to be a lot smaller. So the amp just has less to work with and, will typically be less distorted, less crunchy. It'll sound a bit thinner and that sort of thing. So that's really kind of the difference when you send it sort of different signals by controlling that with the volume knob on your guitar. But really, at the end of the day, the main thing you should keep in mind is just that the volume knob on your guitar isn't really a volume knob. Like, it's going to change the sound of your amp and not just make it quieter or louder. So, when you change what your volume knob's set to, it's also going to affect the sound of your amp. And that's a nice segue into the second point I want to talk about, which is how you can actually leverage the volume knob to add a ton of expressiveness to your playing. So there are a ton of ways you can change the sound coming out of your amp. You can use pedals, you can use a foot switch to switch between the different channels on your amp. But with all those approaches, really, you're often going to have a really drastic change in your tone, or at least a really pretty noticeable change, either going from something like a clean tone to a distorted tone, or, going from something dry with no effects to something with a lot of effects or something like that. But with the volume knob, you can be really subtle, and you can also control it obviously directly from your guitar. So it has the ability to add a ton of nuance to your playing, and because it's so close to where your picking hand is usually, you can incorporate it directly as part of your playing. So there are obviously a ton of ways you could use the volume knob, but I'll just talk through a few of the ways I use it personally. So one thing I think is really great is if you're doing a solo or playing a lead part or something like that, if you have a tone that has quite a bit of gain and distortion, you can roll off the volume knob really whenever, like mid-solo on certain sections or things like that. You can roll it off to about halfway or maybe a little bit past halfway, and that'll clean up your tone a lot. So it'll have way less distortion. It'll maybe be more on sort of the edge of breakup and sound kind of clean, but still have a little bit of grit to it. And that can just really spice up your solo because you're not going to just have the same tone the whole time, and can really make it a lot more interesting. And another thing that technique is great for is if you do have a pretty distorted tone, rolling off the volume knob can actually add a lot of clarity because you'll lose some of that distortion and get some clarity in return. So if you're playing like chord arpeggios or something with kind of a lot of notes that are ringing out, that can be a nice way to bring in more clarity into your tone and not make it so it just sounds super muddy or something. And the last technique I'll mention is just doing swells with the volume knob. So this is something you can definitely do with an expression pedal or a dedicated volume pedal. But there's something nice about doing it with the volume knob. I mean, it is a little different since, as we talked about, it behaves more like a gain knob. So it'll sound a little bit different, but it really just gives you a ton of control being able to do it right from your guitar. And yeah, that can be a great technique to have in your toolbox. All right, and that's it for this video. Let me know if you found this helpful, and also let me know if there's anything else about the volume knob that I didn't mention in this video, but you think is also worth knowing. But until next time, thanks for watching. Peace.